Carrie and I tied the knot 6 years ago. In these tales, folks often portray their wives as truly remarkable, and I get that, having had ample time to reflect. My wife Carrie was undeniably attractive, unquestionably exceptional, hard to put into words. I was attracted to her for sure. We go way back, all the way to our teenage years. Interestingly, I'm a few years her senior. To me, she was always the young girl from down the street. However, something occurred when she was 14 that seemed to forge a connection between us. Right before heading off to college, I parted ways with my friends after a night at the pub. It wasn't too late, but darkness was settling in as I opted for a shortcut through the local park. It turned out to be a fortunate choice. I stumbled upon young Carrie facing trouble with a couple of boys around her age. Trouble might be an understatement. It was quite serious. If I hadn't arrived at that precise moment, who knows what could have transpired. According to her, I played the hero, swooping in just in time to rescue her. However, the truth was that when I confronted the two guys, they got scared and quickly left. In any case, I became something special to her. Throughout the rest of the summer, I observed her not exactly trailing me, but certainly making an effort to be wherever I was. Naturally, my friends teased me since at 18, I was deemed too old for her. Yet, even then, I had to acknowledge she was a remarkably attractive young lady with, even at that age, a pair of incredibly well-shaped long legs. After that, I embarked on a 3-year study period and hardly crossed paths with her until I returned after graduating, spending an extended summer there before heading off to my new job. By that time, she was 18, and I was almost 22, a somewhat different situation altogether. This aligned with the fact that she had blossomed into a beautiful young woman, making her ongoing affection for me quite understandable. We entered into a relationship, becoming a couple, strolling hand in hand in the park, and seizing every opportunity for kisses and cuddles. By then, I was no longer a Vestal, but she still was. Despite a few close calls, she maintained her pureness. This isn't to say that I didn't explore the delightful softness of her body, but that was the extent of it. I wasn't overly concerned, as deep down, I still saw myself as her protector. Carrie continued recounting the time I rescued her from a dire situation, and I'm pretty certain that summer strengthened her love for me. Honestly, I wasn't far behind in falling even more deeply for her, though it wasn't a mutual feeling at the time. Despite openly discussing alternative paths, we sadly went our separate ways, Carrie to Leeds Metropolitan University, and me to my inaugural job in Bristol. We were quite geographically distant. While she pledged fidelity, I took it with a grain of salt, having experienced the changes and temptations during my own 3 years as a student. I did visit her a few times, but during the last visit, it became evident she had another life to contend with, and we gradually drifted apart. That could have been the end of it, as I certainly didn't linger. I embraced a few years of revelry on the Bristol scene, exploring different relationships. However, my trajectory shifted, leading me back closer to home, where Carrie re-entered my life. By then, she had graduated and was already working when her parents invited me over. I must admit, the initial welcome from darling Carrie was a bit less warm than anticipated. However, that quickly changed. Indeed, she transformed herself, matured, and gained sophistication and worldly wisdom. Yes, she lost her pureness, but not to me. Nonetheless, it wasn't a significant concern, and who was I to complain? Then, one evening, she confided to someone that I remained her special hero, and it felt like we were picking up where we had left off. I rekindled my connection with her, and this time, we didn't stop there. We soon became involved in bed, and the more we shared our love, the deeper it grew. Marriage followed inevitably, as certain as morning follows night. 6 years later, we were still as deeply in love as ever. Carrie, at times a bit conservative, disapproved of various things, but never pushed her views too strongly, making it a non-issue. We were genuinely happy, and the future looked promising. My problem arose when my company decided to promote me, a situation I had no issue with, except that it meant relocating to the vibrant city of Leeds, where my loving wife had spent her university years. It was a choice between that and the Middle East, and since we wanted to start a family, Leeds seemed the more sensible option. Initially, there were no problems, at least not for the first couple of weeks as we settled into a temporary rented flat. I knew I would miss watching Arsenal play football, and Leeds City wasn't about to replace them in my affections. After all, Billy Brimner and crew had long since retired, but overall, Leeds didn't seem like a bad place to be. For those unfamiliar, it's a lively city with a bustling nightlife. Then one evening she suggested we take a tour of the city and visit some places she used to frequent as a student. We had drinks in a few student pubs, but even Carrie felt somewhat out of place after 8 years since her Leeds Met graduation. We dined at a restaurant where she once worked, but she found no familiar faces, and the decor had changed. It was evident she felt a bit let down by the evening. It lacked the magic she had hoped for. It's strange how a place's transformation since your last visit can be so disappointing. The whole evening seemed destined for a poor ending. Finally, she declared that there was a little pub on the edge of town where she worked during her final year. It wasn't a student pub, so maybe some locals would still be around. It was still early evening as we walked hand in hand through the city center, resembling two lovers. We left the car behind until she led me down a couple of back alleys, and the nature of the buildings began to change from bright city lights to shabby backstreet houses and crumbling workshops. I felt doubtful and asked Carrie if it was like this when she was here. She laughed, assuring me it hadn't changed. She had lived nearby in a cheap flat shared with 3 other girls, one of whom worked at the same pub for some time. She pointed around a corner and mentioned that her joy was evident, making me grin. There, in front of us, was a dingy-looking pub I wouldn't have entered on my own, but with Carrie, it was different. Not that she dressed provocatively, that wasn't her style. Carrie epitomized elegance, from her neatly cut dark hair to her smart suits and formal high heels. That evening was an exception, with her in a slightly daring short skirt. I joked that maybe it was to recall her student days, but on second thought, perhaps she had some inkling of how the evening would unfold. Maybe not, though. No, I think if she had known then, she wouldn't have left our flat. The pub was called the Rose and Crown, with 2 typical big period-etched, multicolored windows to the front that undoubtedly looked splendid in their time. I questioned hesitantly if she was sure this was it. She assured me that it wasn't so bad once you get inside. With that, she gave me a beautiful smile, the one I'd cherished since I knew her as a young girl, and pushed open the pub door. Little did I know then that I would never feel the same again about that smile. I followed her inside, and she was correct. The interior was old-fashioned but quite tidy, featuring a long, dark wooden bar and a charming old mirror behind it. Surprisingly, the windows, which appeared grubby from outside, looked fine from within as the street lamp lights shone through them, casting a warm glow on the bar. Carrie stood there, finely enchanted, recognition evident on her face. She remarked that it hadn't changed a bit. I added that I shouldn't think it had changed much in 50 years, eliciting a giggle from her as she lovingly looked up at me. She pointed and exclaimed about something at the other end of the bar, releasing my hand and sliding across the wooden floor. She greeted the bartender with a, "Hi there, remember me?" The bartender turned around to look at her, appraising the pretty young woman in front of him. A smile broke across his face as he recognized her and exclaimed, "Carrie, is that really you, Carrie?" Carrie nodded in confirmation, grinning up at the tall, lanky bartender, whose name I never did discover. I couldn't help but grin myself, realizing that Carrie had finally found someone who remembered her, and the evening wasn't going to be a total waste after all. He expressed joy and rushed from behind the bar, embracing Carrie tightly and planting a full-on kiss on her lips. The embrace and kiss didn't last long enough for me to feel jealous or anything, but the first uneasy feeling crept coldly through my gut, wiping the grin from my face. They chatted animatedly about things unfamiliar to me, and I waited for an introduction. As they discussed people Carrie had known back then, I still waited in vain to be introduced when another man entered the pub. The bartender called out to him, urging him to see who had turned up. He walked right by me, exclaiming, "Carrie!" as soon as he spotted her again. I had to endure my wife being embraced and kissed by a man I'd never seen before. Once again, I waited in vain to be introduced. The second man informed her that Carl would be there any moment, and to my surprise, she blushed. He noted her reaction, saying he thought that would get to her. Carrie responded, "Really, Carl still comes." The man assured her that Carl would really be there soon. I wondered who Carl was. Carrie had never mentioned a Carl before, which was perfectly reasonable, but I didn't like where the evening was headed, and I didn't appreciate being ignored. I remained standing there on my own, feeling like a bystander. I cleared my throat in an attempt to catch her attention, and when that failed, I coughed loudly. The bartender glanced at me, but Carrie continued to ignore me, engrossed in conversation with the other man. The bartender apologized, saying he would be with me in a minute. Unsure of what to do, I could have grabbed her arm or something, but she was so engrossed in reconnecting with old friends that I chose to bide my time. I walked up to the bar just behind them and leaned on the counter. The bartender finally tore himself away from my wife and asked, "Yes, mate? What can I get you?" I told him I'd like a pint of the best and whatever the lady wanted. The barman's smile vanished as I spoke. He snapped at me, seemingly oblivious to the fact that I was her husband or that she was even with me, saying he didn't think this young lady accepts drinks from just anyone. I retorted, my temper starting to rise, that I believed she would have a drink with me. The barman began to say, "Now look here, buddy, you can't come in here." However, that's as far as he got, as Carrie finally turned around, the raised voices finally catching her attention, and she intervened. She casually informed the other two that it was okay, and he was with her, hardly bothering to glance over at me. The barman fell silent but continued to scowl at me as he poured my beer. He demanded 2 pounds and 20 pence, pushing the glass across the counter toward me. I asked about the lady's drink, and the bartender brusquely informed me that it was on the house. He promptly asked her what she wanted, and poured it without acknowledging me. I stood there sipping my pint, puzzled about what was happening. My wife was engrossed in conversation with the others, laughing and giggling as they shared old stories and updates since she had left. Carl's name came up multiple times, and a concerning smile appeared on Carrie's face each time. She continued to completely ignore me, and I was becoming quite upset by her strange behavior. I was about to step in between them to regain my wife's attention when the pub door opened, and 2 big guys walked in, one W. Punche and the other West Indian. The barman exclaimed the moment he saw them, informing them that Carl had turned up out of the blue. So, this was the mysterious Carl, a sizable guy, appearing rather tough. Carl halted when he noticed Carrie, and a huge grin spread across his face. He shouted, "Surprise, Carrie! Where have you appeared from?" Without saying anything more, he rushed past me, and as the others made way, he embraced her. Carrie kissed him back with equal enthusiasm. This time, it lingered a bit too long for my liking, and the way the others stood there beaming at the two of them while locked together didn't help either. Then his left hand dropped down her back, cupping the cheek of her bottom. I'd had enough. I stepped forward to intervene, deciding that if Carrie was going to allow that, and couldn't even involve me with her friends, then it was time to leave. I managed only one step forward, and came to an abrupt stop with a large, strong hand on my shoulder, gripping me hard. A deep voice from behind me, belonging to the guy, said, "Wouldn't if I were you, buddy," as I realized he had anticipated my move and stepped forward to prevent it. I angrily told him to get his hand off me, trying unsuccessfully to shake him off. All 4 guys turned toward me at that point, all squaring up, anticipating trouble. Carrie told them to leave me be before anything happened, saying I brought her there tonight and that I was fine and I wouldn't cause any problems. She said all this without even looking at me or acknowledging me in any way. Her head turned toward me for a moment, but our eyes never met. The big guy warned me to stay cool, a hint of threat in his voice. He released my shoulder, but guided me away from the group, positioning his large frame between them and me. I couldn't believe what was happening. An icy lump started to form in my gut. Just 20 minutes earlier, I had strolled hand in hand with my beloved wife through the heart of Leeds city center, blissfully in love. Now, I found myself sidelined and excluded as she gravitated toward one of the tables in the increasingly crowded pub. I observed several attractive yet provocatively dressed women approaching Carl or his sidekick, engaging in brief conversations before leaving or taking their places at the bar. I wasn't so naive as to miss what these women were, or more precisely, what they did for a living. My somewhat prim and proper wife was socializing with a pimp. He must have been one. Carl must have been a bloody pimp. Could she be so oblivious not to recognize her surroundings? Regardless, Carrie and I needed to leave. I called out loudly enough for her not to feign ignorance, saying it's time we left. I urged her, "Come on now, Carrie, it's time to go." She glanced over at me, and the smile vanished, replaced by a troubled expression. She didn't say no, nor did she say anything at all. Carrie simply shook her head at me and turned back to her friends, the smile returning. And before long she was giggling like a little schoolgirl, apparently having forgotten that I was even there. The deep voice at my elbow warned me to play it cool or piss off, saying he wouldn't warn me again. I started to protest, but he put his huge hand on my chest and pushed me firmly away from the group set around the table and back up to the bar. He informed me that the lady didn't seem interested in me and suggested I stay there and wait for her if I wanted, or go home. He even suggested finding another date for the night or trying one of their ladies. Without waiting for me to say anything, he beckoned one of the women over, and she responded immediately, standing right beside me. He introduced her as Sally, telling me it would cost, but she would take care of me tonight. He advised me to piss off with her and forget about the little lady over there, as she and Carl had a lot to catch up on. He apologized if my date didn't go as expected tonight, stating that's life. He backed off and went back to the table, leaving me speechless with rage. The courtesan Sally warned me not to push my luck, cautioning that the pair of them should not be messed with. She suggested I let her go and find another girl for the night, mentioning that she is attractive enough. I looked at her with disbelief and hissed that the woman in question is not my girlfriend, but my wife. Sally, realizing her mistake, exclaimed and expressed concern, acknowledging that the situation was bad. Desiring to return to the table, I found Sally blocking my way. She advised me to hold on, stating that I really wouldn't want to do that. Frustrated, I demanded to know what I should do. Sally offered to talk to my wife for me, asking if she was genuinely my wife. The look on my face alone convinced her. Holding up the palm of her hand to ensure I didn't follow her, she slowly threaded her way through to the table where Carrie and the others were sitting. I observed as she bent down and whispered something in Carrie's ear. Carrie looked up in my direction for the first time since she'd entered the pub, her eyes meeting mine. There was almost a look of surprise as she looked over at me, as if she had genuinely just remembered my presence. She looked sheepishly away, and then whispered something back to Sally. Sally conveyed to me that Carrie mentioned she would come over and see me shortly upon returning. I responded by expressing my impatience, stating that I wanted her to be here now, not in a minute. Sally cautioned me, saying, "Don't push your luck, mister," before walking away to approach another customer further down the bar. I stood there enraged, unable to divert my gaze from Carrie, noticing Carl's arm sliding across her shoulders, his fingers casually brushing against one of her chest balloons. She threw a few watery smiles my way, but I found myself counting the minutes, wondering at which point I would explode. After 5 minutes, she stood up and excused herself, not coming straight over to me. Instead, Carrie made her way to the toilets and disappeared through the door. I didn't know if she wanted me to follow or not, unsure of what to do. Before I could decide, she came out again, and glancing over toward Carl's group, approached me. I angrily demanded what she was playing at, insisting that we needed to leave immediately. When I reached for her arm, she pushed me away and backed off, instructing me not to cause a scene. She conveyed that I could go if I wanted, but she intended to stay there for a while. Carrie firmly informed me that she was staying to chat with her old friends. She suggested I could go and come back later for her, or stay there and wait. I looked at her in disbelief, finding it hard to comprehend that the woman who had professed her love for me earlier that day was now telling me to leave. When I failed to respond, she continued, saying, "Better if you just go home, Terry. I'll get a taxi back later. We'll talk about this then." I cried out, expressing that I wasn't leaving her there. She responded resignedly, stating, "Just stay and watch then, Terry, if you must. You might not like what you see, but for your own sake, don't interfere." Despite my attempts to persuade her to leave with me, she resisted, suggesting it would be better if I left now. She assured me, "I'll see you later. Don't worry, sweetheart. Everything will be okay afterwards. I love you and will make it up to you, I promise." She said to just give her this one evening, assuring that everything would be like before, and attempted to move away. I seized her arm, astounded at her outrageous behavior. Before I knew it, I was flung back against the bar as the big guy knocked my arm away from my wife and me. I took a swing at him, but it seemed futile. He shoved me further along the bar and then pushed me to the ground, reminding me that he had warned me. A nasty grin adorned his face. He picked me up as if I were a featherweight and propelled me toward the door. Ted cried out not to hurt me, insisting that I hadn't done any real damage. I don't really know if her pleas had any effect on the outcome, but at least she tried. The next thing I knew, I was outside and doubling up as he punched me in the stomach and then reeling backward as he punched me in the chest. It felt as if I'd been punched by a train, and I fell flat on my back and waited for the smacking to continue. It didn't come. I lay there for a good while wondering how the hell I had gotten there. I had a pain in my chest from where he had punched me and was fighting for my breath due to the blow to my middle. 2 punches, just 2 casual punches, and I had been reduced to a wreck, aching all over and still unable to stand up. Another 10 minutes passed, and I managed to pull myself up to my feet, shaking off the dust and grime from my clothes. How could an evening that had started so wonderfully have descended so far? It was the same thing. I just didn't know what the hell to do. I'm no softy, but how could I stand up to a great hulk like that? He'd homicide me. I'd never felt so damn humiliated and hopeless in my entire life. Some bloody special hero I was. It wasn't as if I even knew anyone in Leeds. I didn't have a friend to call for help. I stood there and watched the slow stream of clients going in and out of the pub. More than a few guys went in and came out later with one of the women on their arm. The pub was a brothel. My wife of 6 years, who only that morning I had discussed having children with, was in a brothel. She'd taken me there and must have known. I fought back the tears and knew what I had to do. I couldn't walk away and leave her there like that. I didn't know what I was going to do with her, but I couldn't walk off and abandon her. If she didn't come home with me this time, then potentially our wonderful, perfect marriage was over. I guess more than an hour had passed before I managed to get myself ready to go back inside the pub. I didn't know what to expect. I certainly never expected what confronted me. I guess you might describe it as an impromptu striptease act. It was my wife and another girl. My wife had the last shred of clothes on her, and that was about to go off. A large group of guys surrounded the pair of them, grinning and laughing as Carrie's last clothes came off. I couldn't stand it. I charged forward, pushing my way through the other men, and grabbed at Carrie. She looked around at me, a startled look on her face. All she managed to express was her distress, saying, "Oh no, Terry! Oh, for Christ's sake, no!" I fared no better than the last time, and the lights started to go out for me as someone smashed me hard in the face. The last thing I remember seeing was Carl, clutching my wife in his arms. I think she had a look of horror on her face as she watched me being dragged out of the pub. They weren't so easy on me the second time, and it was several hours later that I fully came to in the middle of a car park some distance from the pub. I heard all over, but I guess they were experts, and though I was in pain, nothing seemed to be broken. It took me an hour to find my way back to our car, and another before I managed to start it and drive back to our new rented flat. I fell asleep on the sofa, not knowing and by then beyond caring at what time Carrie would be home. The following morning I woke up feeling worse than end of life. I had a very long, very hot shower, and at last my body started to feel like it belonged to me again. I got slowly dressed, trying not to think of the previous evening, but I just couldn't stop. I didn't know if the pain in my body was as bad as the pain in my brain. Was my marriage over? I had no idea, but it seemed pretty likely. For the life of me, I couldn't understand what had happened. How could my loving wife Carrie have acted like that? I'd known her all those years, but quite obviously not as well as I thought. It was 11 o'clock in the morning, and where the hell was she? I was not going to chase back over. The phone had only been connected the day before, and unless it was a double-glazing salesman on a cold call, then the only person other than myself who had the number was my darling wife. I answered after picking it up. She greeted me quietly, asking if I was okay. I responded, questioning her understanding of the situation. She expressed remorse, stating her regrets for the previous night's events. She mentioned her mistake in returning to the pub and asked about my whereabouts. I demanded to know where she was, but ignored her question about my well-being. She urgently claimed, "No, don't be stupid, Terry. The only one was—" She left the sentence unfinished, realizing what she was about to say. Neither of us said anything for several minutes, though I could hear her sobbing on the other end of the line. She pleaded for understanding, expressing her desire for me to comprehend her actions. She asked to come home and wanted things to return to how they were. She promised to explain everything if given a chance. Desperately, I wanted to tell her to leave, but this had to be sorted out one way or the other. I stated that she should make her own way home or get one of her boyfriends to drive her back. "Oh, thank you, Terry," she whimpered. "I'll be back in half an hour at the most. It will all be okay, you'll see. Everything will be okay." I slammed the phone down before she had time to say anything else. Damn it, bugger it. I loved her, but I hated her. What the hell was I going to say to her when she got back? Was I going to tell her to pack her bags, or would I take her in my arms? As it turned out, I didn't have to make that decision. Half an hour passed, then the full hour. The afternoon turned into evening, and still no sign of my errant wife. By 8 p.m., it was obvious she wasn't actually going to come home. Not that night anyway. And for me, that meant possibly not any night in the future. As each hour had passed, I had gotten angrier and angrier, not shouting and screaming angry, but with cold, calculating fury that consumed me. I put a few things in the car and drove very carefully back to the city center, hoping that I could find the pub again that Carrie had taken me to the night before. After several mistakes, I eventually recognized a large factory, and just down the road, the Rose and Crown pub. Parking the car just around the corner, I got out and walked towards the bar, outwardly confident, but my heart pounding away inside. I had to admit I was nervous, even physically frightened after what they'd done to me the previous night. I hesitated by the front door, not knowing what to expect. I didn't even know for sure if Carrie was still in there. I pushed the door open and went in. The atmosphere resembled the previous night, populated by rough-looking characters and even rougher-looking women. I recognized several faces, and a couple of them appeared surprised to see me. If they weren't certain it was me from the night before, the black eye and bruises on my face would have given it away. The barman, upon spotting me, inquired, "Haven't you had enough, mate?" I demanded to know the whereabouts of my wife, expressing my frustration. At least he had the decency to appear surprised. He questioned the idea that Carrie was my wife, screwing his face up in confusion. I nodded to confirm. He reacted with disbelief, exclaiming, "Bloody hell, she told us you were just a date." The barman, recalling the events of the previous night, and perhaps more that occurred after I was thrown out, looked at me with sympathy. He sensed trouble, though he couldn't predict the nature of it. He just knew there was going to be an issue. He sloped his head to one side, indicating the far corner. When I looked over, there she was. Carrie sat on Carl's knee. Neither of them had noticed me enter, and I crossed over to them before they realized I was there. Carrie gasped in surprise and tried unsuccessfully to pull her blouse back over to cover her body. She needn't have bothered, as we'd all seen them before. Carl simply grinned at me. That sort of grin when you know you've got the better of someone. I remarked to Carrie about the seemingly extended half-hour, inquiring if something had caused a delay. Initially, she responded with silence, her expression reflecting shock. Carl scornfully retorted, instructing me to leave and claiming he would send her home when he deemed fit. Carrie, finally finding her voice, whispered assurances to me, pleading, "Please, Terry, I'll definitely be back home later, I promise you." Carl laughed, kissed her, and taunted me more than her. He asserted control, declaring, "You'll go when I say you can," while keeping a watchful eye on me to gauge my reaction. I addressed Carrie, disregarding Carl's sneers. I conveyed to her that it was her last chance, emphasizing that the decision needed to be made at that moment. I had contemplated the situation extensively, and believed that even then, if she had chosen to come with me, prioritizing me over him, I would have attempted to work through the issues. Perhaps we could overcome what had happened. At that point, I wasn't entirely sure, but there was a possibility. She looked at me pitifully, indecision written all over her face. Her eyes, her lovely brown eyes said it all. She knew how much she had hurt me, but instead of doing what she knew she should, she was calculating how much more she could get away with. How much further could she push me, and still have me come back for more? Carrie eventually whispered, urging me to be reasonable. In that moment, I realized she had failed me once again, and it was the end for us. She continued, expressing how much she desired to see her old friends again and relive her old student days one last time. She asked me to hang on a little longer while she had her last gentle little fling, promising that everything would return to normal. She insisted that she genuinely loved me and assured me that she would make it up to me. She stared at me imploringly, her eyes begging me to agree, but I said nothing in reply. Carrie went to say something else to me, but Carl had had enough as well. He kissed her hard and threw out even harder, and her words were transformed into nothing. That was it. I had all the information I needed. My wife was coming back home after all, but I'd have to wait until tomorrow or maybe the day after, or the day after that. Fine. That was great, wasn't it? I noticed that the West Indian guy was edging over towards me, so I held up my hands and backed off. No point in getting involved in a one-sided fight with him again. The whole bar had fallen silent, waiting to see what was going to happen, but as far as I was concerned, nothing was going to happen, at least not straight away. "See you all later then," I said quietly. "I'm not still 14, Terry," Carrie burst out. "I can look after myself now." Even her face fell when she saw how that punched me, her one special thing over all those years, and she was throwing it back in my face. "I'm sorry, Terry," she started. "I really didn't mean that But I ignored her, taking no notice of her incoherent apology. As I backed out through the door, Carl laughed out loud again and slid her blouse right off her, reaching up under her skirt even as I watched to rub my face in my misery. It could have been that caused the tears to roll down her cheeks, but somehow I doubted it. I guess she still loved me in her way, and to see me humiliated like that again could have just been too much. That's what I like to think anyway. As I closed the door behind me, the silence in the pub crashed as everyone started to talk and laugh at the same time. I guess they thought they'd seen the last of me. Strolling slowly back to my car, I opened the boot and took out the stuff that I'd put there before I left the house. Anybody watching me would have thought I was cool and relaxed, whereas actually I was fuming inside, terrified of what I had decided to do, not knowing how it was going to turn out. I had a license for my over and under 12-bore Browning rifle. I'd been going to clay pigeon shooting for a couple of years by then, and though I wasn't very good at it, I figured I didn't have to be for what I had planned. I selected a handful of cartridges, making sure they were all small caliber, as I didn't want to end up in prison on a homicide charge. I broke the weapon and pushed 2 rounds in, putting the rest in my jacket pocket. A few moments later, and I was back outside the pub, staring at the 2 big engraved windows. This will wake them up, I thought, my heart thundering away inside my jacket. This wasn't me. It just wasn't me. But what else was I to do? There was no mileage in going back in and arguing with her, as she wouldn't agree, and I'd probably get another smacking. What would I do if I simply went home, wait for her to come back to me and discuss how we might get over what she had done, how she had humiliated me? No bloody way. It had gone beyond that by now, and I wasn't taking any more crap from any of them. Taking aim at the first window, I squeezed the trigger just like I'd been taught. My arm was trembling, shaking even, and the barrel of the rifle was swaying around uncertainly in a large circle as I fought to control my nerves. It didn't matter, really, as I was no more than 12 or 15 from the window. I increased the pressure on the trigger and resisted the urge to close my eyes. There was a loud bang, and an instant later, the whole window disintegrated in a twirling mass of broken glass. I took aim at the second window with renewed confidence, fired off the second barrel, and the other window followed suit. The report from the weapon echoed round the surrounding buildings, far louder than it had ever before sounded when I had shot previously out in an open field and mingled with the tinkling of fallen glass. I calmly dug 2 more cartridges from my pocket and loaded them into the weapon. Then I waited to see what would happen. I really had no idea how they would respond, and almost hoped that they wouldn't. But I was ready and prepared to show them that they'd made a big mistake if they thought I was a wimp and would take what they had done to me lying down. The doors flew open, and several guys poured out. They stopped dead when they saw me, stood there with the weapon. Nobody moved. Then Carl came charging out, closely followed by his big henchman. "Stupid effing stinker!" he screamed at me and charged me, maybe thinking I'd not thought to reload, maybe not thinking at all. I took careful aim somewhere around his knees, as I didn't want to risk actually execute him and put pressure on the trigger. I was as cool as a cucumber, even having time to note that my arms no longer trembled, and that the weapon was pointing exactly where I was aiming it. Time seemed to slow down. I had all the time in the world. I quite clearly saw the look on his face change from rage to terror as he realized that he had made a serious error of judgment. Maybe I had the same grin on my face that he'd had just a few moments before. You remember the one when you know you've really got the better of someone? Bang! He went down screaming, even surprising me with the mess it made of his legs. Fair play to the guy. He didn't even hesitate. Great courage or no brains, I'm not sure. But he didn't stop, not that is, till the second barrel load ripped into his legs and put him down as well. The two of them lay on the ground, Carl screaming and the guy, Ted, groaning aloud. I didn't even bother to reload that time. My emotions were too shot. But fortunately, the rest of the crowd suddenly melted away. Everything went calm. Relatively, that is, as two injured guys can make a lot of noise. It was a short walk back to the car, though my legs were so wobbly I thought I might fall over. The rifle went back in the boot, and I gingerly started the motor and made my way home. I drove slowly and very carefully indeed. I'd thought of going into the pub to frighten the crap out of Carrie, but I couldn't. I didn't trust myself. And to be honest, it had terrified me, doing what I'd just done. But I'd done it, though. I'd bloody well done it, just as I'd promised myself I would. But enough was enough. Strangely, I slept well that night and woke up quite fresh. Black eye and bruised face still, but otherwise quite fresh. I wondered who would turn up first, Carrie or the police, to arrest me. I hadn't even put the rifle away, and it was still in the boot of my car. As it turned out, Carrie couldn't turn up. About 10 o'clock, I got a phone call asking me if I was the husband of Carrie Bellings. Yes, I am, I replied, wondering what it was about. It was the police. That morning, I had anticipated a visit from them, perhaps for my arrest. However, the call I received was about Carrie. They informed me that she was under arrest at the station and asked me to come and collect her. My genuine surprise prompted me to question the reason for her arrest. The reply was unsettling. She had been taken in for prostitution, along with a group of other working girls after a shooting on the edge of town. In response, I expressed a realization, understanding the reasons behind her recent behavior and late-night returns. The police officer acknowledged my understanding somberly, expressing regret for the way I had found out, noting that such situations were not uncommon. Unfortunately, my comments seemed to contribute to her unfortunate fate. It turned out they initially considered her to be more upper class than the other women involved, and my refusal to collect her likely exacerbated the situation. As a result, she was prosecuted, found guilty, lost her new job, and faced challenges in securing future employment, given the stigma associated with a prostitution conviction for a young female graduate. The police didn't even ask me whether I owned a rifle. Mine was registered to me quite openly back in Bedford, where we just moved from, but they never even checked. I wasn't a suspect in any way, so why would they? But why did nobody from the pub split on me? Well, I had no idea at all. Carrie tried to contact me time and time again. I never met up with her again, but I did eventually accept one of her calls after she got more and more desperate. She told me she still loved me and all the usual rubbish. I think she really did as well, and obviously was broken-hearted that I wouldn't entertain taking her back. I refused to even discuss it, and she acted a little frightened of me after I had dealt with our problem as firmly as I had. When I questioned Carrie about her past involvement with Carl and her job at the pub during her student days, she was straightforward with me. I demanded an explanation, asking how she transitioned from working behind the bar to the events that transpired the other night. Carrie clarified that she had never mentioned working behind the bar at the pub during her student days. The weight of those words punched me hard. It suddenly became clear. She had worked for Carl as one of his girls. The realization explained the hold he had over her. I had unknowingly married an ex-courtesan, and it took going back to that place to uncover the truth. Whether that revelation was a good or bad thing, it's hard to determine. That's a judgment others will have to make for themselves. It was her that warned me that Carl would come looking for me to sort me out himself once he was back on his feet. That is, maybe that's why nobody from the pub told the police about me, as people like that sort their own problems out. He'd never find me. Of course, I backed out of the job in Leeds, which they understood after the news of my wife got out, but I took the one in the Middle East, where they were happy to have me on a bachelor posting as they're cheaper than a married couple. That's about where we came in. I suppose I got away with it. To my surprise, I actually got away with it, and they put it all down to a gangland shooting. I suppose you might be wondering what then happened to me. Okay, well, that's natural. As you might imagine, I gave up clay pigeon shooting and sold my rifle, and then took up golf instead. Got quite good at it as well, and eventually got my handicap down to 6. I went out with quite a few different women, but only discovered just how good my wife Carrie had really been in bed. Well, she would have been, wouldn't she, as she had worked at it, as it were, in both senses of the word. Then I met up with Angie, a lovely American woman who I met in Dubai. Life was fine after that, really fine. I never inquired too deeply quite where she'd gained her experience, but I really think she was just a gifted amateur. I hoped so. Anyway, we have never married. She didn't want to. And strictly speaking, I was still married. And I still haven't bothered to get divorced. I came back to the UK occasionally, but always steered clear of Leeds till at last I couldn't resist it. One Thursday in June found me slowly driving past the Rose and Crown, hoping that nobody would recognize me after all that time. The fine decorated windows had been replaced by some modern double-glazed units. Pity, really. I'd rather like them. I sat there in my car for a while, and at last, to my surprise, a guy in a wheelchair turned up. He was a big chap and tough-looking, but fatter than I'd remembered. Carl. But of course, I'd only seen him a few short times, and that had been 4 or 5 years previously. What clinched it was the big man pushing him, the one with the really bad limp. That could only have been Ted. Then several women poured out of the pub to see Carl, report to him. Maybe that being easier, no doubt, than getting him up the 3 steep steps into the bar. They all looked rough, just like the last time I'd been there. Except one of them, that is. One of them looked that little bit different. Pretty, slender, beautiful, long legs. Well, yes, it could have been her, though she looked much, much older. She still kept her hair short, and was still quite smartly dressed. Her eyes had a worn-out look about them, though, and the smile that I had once loved was nowhere to be seen. She didn't look very happy at all, but I didn't hang around to make sure she was, as she'd said, not 14 anymore, and could look after herself. Strange how things turn out, isn't it? If only that bloody restaurant hadn't redecorated their dining room, then maybe she would be at home right now with our children, the ones we'd never now have. I wouldn't have been any the wiser, and maybe we would have lived happily ever after.